Hello there, I'm Tikki Fullerton and welcome to this special budget edition of Tikki, coming to you live from Canberra for the 2019 federal budget with a full hour ahead of top drawer commentary and analysis. Well, coming up, Minister for Finance and the Leader of the Government in the Senate, Senator Matthias Cormann, joins me with his message of now's not the time for changing leadership. He has unfinished business. Can the budget do enough to turn the polls in his favour? Shadow Finance Minister Dr Jim Chalmers will get Labor's first thoughts on the federal budget and ask how and why Labor's proposals would deliver a better path for Australia. And exclusive to Your Money, venture capitalist and corporate advisor Mark Carnegie will be joining us later on the programme to discuss the budget's impact on the business sector and a few other things. We'll also take you into today's budget lockup with the Australian's editor-at-large Paul Kelly and economist Warren Hogan, so stick around for those talks. I can tell you, coming out of the lockup, The View, underwhelming, not a wow budget, but make no mistake, this is the election budget. The Treasurer in his speech said many times, and all without raising taxes, aimed squarely, no doubt, at Labor's changes to negative gearing and franking credits. Well, the Prime Minister today was at his slickest. Back in black, he Instagrammed and tweeted about the budget. In a nutshell, what we've got is a $4.2 billion deficit this year, but back in the black, a $7.1 billion surplus for 2019-20, a doubling of the tax offset for lower and middle income earners, slightly beating Labor's current offer, and a commitment to flatten the tax rate from 32.5% to 30% for 70% of the population, one of just 3 tax brackets in 2024-5 it would be. An increase in the instant asset write-off for small businesses, a $100 billion infrastructure plan over 10 years, and a $525 million skills package, 80,000 new apprentices.
Lower taxes, more infrastructure, better skills and a quality education. This is our plan, the Morrison government's plan for a stronger economy that will help our nation reach its potential and enable every Australian to reach theirs. Yeah.
Well, I think this had to be a Goldilocks budget. Not too understated, not too self-congratulatory. Treasurer Josh Frydenberg surely could have posted a surplus this year, but the government for a long time now has refused to match what it calls the irresponsible Labor spending programs of Gonski and the NDIS. So the last thing it needed was the optics of a surplus on the back of an underspend on needy Australians. Instead, the message is a responsible economic manager with a pitch on tax, first to middle and lower income families, a $1,000 fillip, $2,000 fillip, and then second to small businesses, with 3.4 million businesses employing 7 million people now eligible for the instant asset write-offs. Very popular in the US when Mr. Trump tried it. Both these are stimulatory just as the property market shakes and global growth slows. But for mums and dads and small businesses to get these goodies, they're going to need to vote the coalition back in. It all comes as a package. Well, let's go straight to our interviews now, and joining me live here in Canberra is the Finance Minister, Senator Matthias Cormann. Senator, great to have you on the show. Now, let's go to the centrepiece first, your income tax offsets. You've more than matched Labor on this, but why shouldn't the public see this as a cash splash, indeed, really a $1,000, $2,000 bribe to vote you back in?
Because it isn't. I mean, this, of course, is part of our plan for a stronger economy and to ensure that hardworking Australians have the best possible opportunity to get ahead. This comes on top, of course, of our income tax relief in last year's budget of $144 billion, which was a comprehensive long-term plan to provide cost of living pressure relief to low-income earners, to address bracket creep, because that is, of course, a drag on economic growth, and also to simplify our tax system. So what we're doing here is, of course, the next step in that tax reform journey by reducing the 32.5% tax bracket to 30%, but again also prioritising low-income earners with cost of living pressure and continuing to address bracket creep. It's part of a long-term plan.
That's all bundled up with the income tax offsets. Now, the question is, though, it's back to the old question of what happens with the equality when you're looking at the amount of tax. You go from 32.5 to 30 for someone earning earning 200,000 as opposed to someone earning 30,000.
Well, the system remains highly progressive. The top 5% of income earners would continue to pay a third of all income tax revenue generated. And furthermore, this is about making sure that 94% of working Australians don't pay more than 30 cents.
But can you get it through on the fairness front in these days when people look at absolute numbers?
Well, it is entirely fair. It is entirely fair because it's about providing working families the right incentive and the right reward for effort, because that is good for the economy overall. Leaving Australians with more of their own hard-earned money, where the government can afford to do so, and providing them the incentive to work harder is good for the economy overall. It helps to lift opportunities for all Australians, including lower income Australians who are breaking into the labour market, who are looking for more hours to work, or indeed who are looking to increase their workforce capacity.
Minister, why didn't you deliver a surplus this year? It was the Treasurer's first budget, could well be on the polls, his only budget as Treasurer. You've never brought down a surplus. I mean, the risk is that neither of you will ever bring down a surplus.
Well, we're making the right decisions for Australia's future. We inherited a rapidly deteriorating budget position when we came into government. And, I mean, you're wrong. I mean, the Treasurer's first budget is a surplus budget. I mean, the Treasurer's first budget is the 1920 budget, and that is a surplus budget.
Well, it's not there yet.
$7.1 billion.
I mean, Wayne Swan promised budgets didn't get there.
But here's the difference between Wayne Swan and us. Wayne Swan made heroic assumptions on things like commodity price forecasts, which never came through. He assumed the best. He assumed high revenues to continue. He spent all the money and more. And then, of course, when the revenue dropped away, he ended up in a big budget mess. And he also lost control of expenditure growth. Expenditure growth under Wayne Swan was running at 4% above inflation. It's running at about 1.9% above inflation under us. We've halved it. Spending under Labor was going to 26.5%.
Let's go to some of this. Let's go to some of your assumptions and some of these savings. For example, your tax to GDP, it stayed well under the 23.9%. You've had your
policy decisions.
You've had your tailwinds of commodity prices.
That's not right.
Well,
that is actually not right. So the iron ore price, for example, was $120 a tonne when we came into government. It's $80 a tonne now. When you talk about tailwinds, you're comparing it to our more prudent assumptions.
Exactly.
Okay, so you're comparing it to our more prudent assumptions.
That's fine. I'm happy to accept that. Let's move to let's move on from Wayne Swan. Let's move on from Wayne Swan.
But I'm comparing it. Under our budget of the last 3 financial years, our budget outcomes have been better than anticipated.
Let me ask about some of your savings, your parameter-driven payments. It's interesting, saving $28 billion by changes to parameters. In other words, changes to programs over the forward estimates. Isn't that a bit heroic?
No, that's actually not right. We're not changing parameters. Parameters are things that we don't control. Parameters in demand-driven programs.
Well, these are movements, changes of the parameters. They are.
No. So the things that we change. We change as a result of policy decisions. When there are changes in economic parameters, when there are changes in demand pressures, up or down, for example, there is a stronger demand expected for public hospitals. So
you're going to get $28 billion in savings from these.
We're going to have to spend $1.9 billion more on public hospitals than previously anticipated. But the rollout of the NDIS has been slightly slower than the ambitious rollout timetable that was previously anticipated. So we're projected, or we're forecast to spend $1.6 billion less than previously anticipated. Not because we've made a decision to reduce funding, but because we're making an assessment of what is likely to happen over the next 4 years based on the best available information in front of us about parameters on things like economic indicators, utilization trends and the like.
Let's go to this target of eliminating debt by 2030, net debt by 2030. Now, clearly it's gone up from 10 to 18% of GDP, even under you guys. I realise you were handed not the greatest of situations. But equally, I'm just looking at this cumulative budget surplus of $45 billion you've got now over the forward estimates. Shouldn't we really be looking at the cumulative headline cash balance, which is more like $5.5 billion? Because the difference being some of these financial assets that you've got to put cash to, NAB loans, drought and rural assistance loans, this is money that's just going to go up against the wall, isn't it?
Well, firstly, government net debt budget is much lower than it would have been if we hadn't made the decisions that we made to reduce expenditure growth from 4% under Labor to 1.9% under us. You know, self-evidently, given that expenditure growth is half, government net debt is already less. It has grown by less. It's continued to grow because we inherited a forward trajectory that was unsustainable. We inherited a forward debt growth trajectory. Yes. Now that we're in surplus, we will be able to pay down gross debt, and of course net debt is the difference between gross debt and the value of relevant assets.
Now, does that include writing down the NBN, for example? That's going to be a lot of money, surely.
This is not... governments do not make discretionary political decisions in relation to the asset value, the value of assets that we hold on behalf of taxpayers. I'm completely bemused by the suggestions by some commentators that somehow the government should make an arbitrary political decision determining the value of the assets we hold, rather than to follow accounting standards and follow the processes.
I suppose the bottom line is you've got a $100 billion infrastructure program. It's a massive program over 10 years. The infrastructure sector is calling for some transparency in how this is done. But
there is transparency.
Part of that is that a lot of these enormous projects are done off balance sheet one way or the other, off budget, sorry, one way or the other, either NBN, Snowy, Inland Rail. Now, how can we keep an eye on what our debt actually is?
Well, debt is reported, the value of assets is reported, so the proposition that this is off balance sheet is wrong. I mean, the value
off budget, sorry.
So the previous government made a decision to invest to fund the rollout of the NBN through equity investments, and that had to comply with certain criteria. There has to be an appropriate level of return for an investment to be classified that way. That continues to be the case. And let me also say that judgment was made when the equity investment was made. So when people are suggesting that somehow there would be a change in budget treatment, there would be a hit to the underlying cash balance if the return were to be less into the future, is wrong. That is not the case.
It's not going to happen.
Well, it doesn't work that way. That is a complete misunderstanding in some sectors. So
there's no impact on our overall net debt if you write down the value of the NBN.
Well, we were talking about the underlying cash balance. There is, of course. I mean,
well, I'm talking about in the context of paying down the net debt to zero over time. And I said, were you going to? I mean, if you have to write down the value of the NBN, that's not going to help, is it?
We don't foresee. I mean, obviously,
you don't foresee that.
Well, everything that we assume will happen is reflected in our budget numbers.
All right. Let me ask you finally about business and small business tax cuts. Obviously, they will be greatly welcomed. Once again, you've got to get this through, haven't you? I mean, you're slowly creeping up in terms of larger and larger companies looking forward to instant asset write-offs and bringing forward company tax cuts to 25%. It's got to get through the Parliament.
We've already legislated the reduction in the corporate tax rate to 25% for all businesses with a turnover of up to $50 million. And indeed, we've accelerated the timetable for that to happen. We've got legislation in front of the Parliament already.
Yes. Now, can you get that through?
Well, we believe we can. We're going to put our case to the Parliament, and it's going to be up to the Parliament to decide.
Yes. Finance Minister Mathias Cormann, it's great to have you on. Thank you so much.
Always good to talk to you.
Well, after the break, we'll get the first thoughts from Labor on this year's federal budget. Shadow Finance Minister Jim Chalmers will join me next. Yes, welcome back. We just heard from the Minister for Finance, Mathias Cormann, on the rationale behind this year's key budget measures. Let's go now to the opposition and find out what Labor thinks of this year's budget. Joining me now is Shadow Finance Minister Dr. Jim Chalmers. Jim, great to have you here.
Thanks, Vicky.
Now, if we heard it once, we heard it I don't know how many times in the Treasurer's speech today. A surplus and a budget, and the government is doing it all without raising taxes. They obviously feel this is going to have some traction.
Oh, look, he did mention that a few times. I noticed that too. The important thing to understand about the surplus, as you understand, and probably most of the people watching the show, is that a surplus hasn't been delivered tonight. It's been forecast tonight for next year. So we won't actually know if the budget's in surplus for the next financial year until September 2020. So nothing's been delivered tonight, and the fact remains that if the government was to change hands in May, I'm not saying that it necessarily will, but if it changed hands in May, the new government would inherit a budget in deficit.
Do you think that, are you surprised that they didn't? They could have delivered a surplus this year. Are you surprised they didn't? And do you think it was perhaps some of the sort of rattling around on NDIS that caused them to change their mind?
Well, it may have been. I mean, the NDIS is a big part of the story. We've had these massive underspends in the budget, and I noticed that you just asked Matthias about that a moment ago. They're very sensitive about it because a lot of the budget improvement in this budget has been on the back of making people with a disability wait longer for the services that they were promised. And so if you think about even the forecast surplus for next year, a big chunk of that is an NDIS underspend. A big chunk of the improvement in the budget this year has been an NDIS underspend. That's a big part of the story. They're very sensitive about it. They want to pretend that it's all about good economic management, but it's hard to say that spending less on people with a disability is good management.
Well, equally, it's also about the right spending. I mean, you surely would know that something like the NDIS has a capacity to sort of get bigger than Ben-Hur if you're not careful with it. Equally, Labor's got a record of some of its programs also going off and getting slightly out of control. So once again, how can the voter be sure that you are the right economic managers?
Well, two things about that. I mean, firstly, we were been told by the government for a long time now that there was pressures on NDIS spending and they needed to raise taxes to pay for it, and it was going to blow out. And now we learn that they've been lying all along. There's been massive underspends, multi-billion-dollar underspends on people with a disability. That's the first point. When it comes to our approach, I do think that the bar is higher for the Labor Party. We do have to convince people that we will be responsible economic managers. Chris Bowen and I have worked on little else for the last almost 3 years, and what we will do is we will take to the election a more responsible approach to the economy than our opponents. We do that because we do understand that people want to see that we have the capacity to manage the economy and manage the budget in the interest of ordinary people in Middle Australia.
Jim, one of the things obviously is this property market. It's not looking fabulous at the moment. It's interestingly that the budget also had some numbers which seem to suggest that a 10% fall in housing could impact the GDP by 0.5%. Into this market, you are presenting these changes to negative gearing.
Well, we've said that we would start our changes on the 1st of January next year. We've said that we would grandfather those changes so that people who are negatively geared now can continue to be so, and people can continue to negatively gear newly constructed properties even after the 1st of January.
It's not going to hit the property market even more.
Well, the point I'm making is it's a very staged introduction. Even the government's own Treasury advisors have said that it would have a negligible impact on the housing market. And besides that, our policy is not designed for the ups and downs of the housing market. It's to make sure that wherever the housing market is, a first home buyer is not competing against somebody who's having their 7th or 8th home subsidised by the taxpayer. The people of Australia can't afford to continue doing that, but it's also unfair, and so we want to level the playing field.
Are you going to support the government if the government remains? Would you support it in terms of its tax package, its income tax package, both the offsets and then the big change and reform?
Well, there's quite a substantial hypothetical there, Tikki, as you'd appreciate. I was a little bit surprised to hear that the government wasn't going to attempt to legislate their tax changes
ram it all through tomorrow.
The election. Well, there'd been an indication that might have been the case, and so now we hear that they won't attempt to do that, and so in lots of ways it just becomes a contest of two competing tax approaches to tax.
Yes.
We are attracted to supporting the changes that they're proposing to the low and middle income tax offset, the LMITO. We are intending to support that. But there's a big gap in there where they've left people under $40,000. They've left them hanging a bit, and so we're going to see what we can do with that group. About 2 million low-income Australians who've been left high and dry again by a government who makes a habit of leaving low-income earners high and dry. So our priority is to see what we can do to fix that part of it. In the broader tax debate, you already know from last budget and from many times since then, people you've had on your show, we don't want to see implemented this kind of flat tax fantasy see at the very top of the tax system. We don't want to see doctors paying the same rate as nurses, and so we've indicated our problems with that part.
They're coming back to you on taxes. I see Angus Taylor is now talking about your lunchbox tax hitting businesses like Bega and Nestle, and who are part of the 250 businesses in your new energy plan, the cap and trade, the safeguard mechanism. Yeah,
well, poor old Angus makes Melissa Price look good. I don't think he's got a lot of credibility necessarily anymore. I think the Australian people are sick and tired of the kind of breathless hyperbole about carbon. We've got a very responsible policy out there.
There have been responsible policies out there before, one would argue, like an NEG. And time after time after time, governments that one would have thought would have got back in actually lose because of their energy and climate policy.
Well, we're very, very happy and very comfortable to have climate change be a key feature of this election campaign. Very comfortable. We're proposing to extend Malcolm Turnbull's safeguard mechanism. We're proposing to have more investment in renewable energy. And the Australian people need and deserve the kind of approach that we've sketched out. If the Liberal Party and the National Party want to have a barney with us over climate change in the election, we are very happy with that.
The costs, which don't seem to have been really set out for voters at this stage, how you're going to fund it?
Well, I think, no, it's not a question of how we'll fund it. We have, as I said before, we'll be very responsible about that. But I think one of the consequences of having this 10-year argument about climate change, which has been unedifying at times, lots of false starts, lots of false dawns. One of the consequences of that, the Australian people have been educated as we go along about the costs of doing nothing. And the costs of doing nothing outweigh the costs of acting. And I think in some ways Angus Taylor and Melissa Price and Scott Morrison, they're kind of fighting yesterday's battle. The Australian people are ready for action and we will give it to them.
Will you keep a deficit levy of sorts, even if there's no deficit?
Well, it's a budget repair levy. We've made it very clear that we would hang on to the budget repair levy until we have strong, sustainable surpluses. And we'll have more
so over 1% of GDP?
Well, we'll have more to say about that. You know, that's been our rule of thumb to now. We'll have more to say about it, but it's not. It's about repairing the budget and making it sustainable again.
And what about business? The government says you are high taxing, and you've got an anti-business agenda. What do you make of their ideas for small business, which I think will be very welcomed by small business?
Well, there's a few things in that. We will support the changes on small business. We're actually the original authors of the instant asset write-off.
Well, as I said, it worked for Donald Trump, didn't it?
Well, we don't have half an hour there, Ticky. But we're the original authors of it. We are inclined to support small business. That's that part of it. On the whole anti-business thing, I mean, I spend most of my week in the boardrooms of Australia talking to business leaders about training, about infrastructure, about how we get the economy growing again. And we haven't mentioned this yet in this interview, but this budget downgrades growth, economic growth, downgrades wages growth, downgrades consumption, and consumption's 60% of the economy. I've heard people say that this will be the basis of their re-election campaign. They will be going to their people on the basis of growth downgraded, wages downgraded, consumption
well, being
downgraded.
Economically responsible, they would say.
But their whole approach over the last 6 years, and people will judge them on the last 6 years, not the next 6 weeks, in my view. Their whole approach has proven to have been failed. We've got slowing growth. You know, all the people-facing parts of the economy are busted. Consumption,
there are not other
debt.
issues playing into that, like global growth and...
Well, the global conditions for the last 6 years overwhelmingly have been positive. Yes, we might be approaching some difficulties, but overwhelmingly for 6 years they've been very positive. And still we've got net debt which has doubled on their watch. And they want to talk about paying down debt. They said that at the start 6 years ago, and it has more than doubled on their watch.
Can I finish by asking you about the living wage and the Labor's interest in having a living wage? What would that do to the budget?
Well, there's lots of swings and roundabouts on wages. Obviously, tax is part of the story. If people are paid higher wages, then the government collects more tax. That's one of the consequences. There's a whole heap of them. But our main interest in seeing a sustainable and responsible increase to the minimum wage is because the main problem we have in this economy is that people don't have the money that they need to spend and provide for their families. The reason the economy is slowing is because consumption is weak, household saving is bad, household debt is bad. All of these things together combine.
But there are concerns in the business community, particularly small business community, that obviously that they will have to try and find that somewhere.
And as I said before, I spent a lot of time with the business community. And I hear those concerns. And something that I was really happy about was when we announced our policy on the minimum wage and the living wage. A lot of the peak groups came out and said we welcome the consultation. We look forward to consulting more about it.
Tim Chalmers, great to get your views. Thank you very much for the response.
Thank you, Tiki.
Well, after the break, we'll get a reaction to the budget from a key figure in the business community. Mark Carnegie, venture capitalist and corporate advisor, will join me next. Welcome back. We're moving to the business side of things. Now, tonight we've heard good news for low and middle income earners with more tax cuts incoming, and small businesses will welcome the extension of the instant asset write-off. But what about the broader business sector, and what about the government's picture on the economy? Good news for business? Well, I'm joined now by venture capitalist and corporate advisor Mark Carnegie, who joins me live from Sydney. Mark, nice to see you there. Now, what was your take of this budget? A lot of people said it just lacked any vavoom.
Well, I'm more worried about the fact that it looked like it got made in the Dunlop rubber factory. I think with the amount of uncertainty we've got in the business world at the moment, the chance that this is going to last to Christmas, even if the government got re-elected, is very, very slim. So that's my biggest concern. You know, it just doesn't really deal with the fact that we've seen this absolute collapse in global long-term interest rates, which really presages a huge, huge change in the economy over the next 6 to 12 months. And I think the budget is underpinned by a set of rosy projections. I just don't think that's going to happen.
So it sounds like you'd be calling for some sort of reform to deal with all of this. What sort of reform are we talking about?
Well, I think you've got some, I mean, it's well known that I think that the idea about trying to find some way to tax the bigger end of town is an important component. So on that particular thing, I come down on the Labor Party rather than the Liberal Party. The second part, in terms of narrow self-interest for the business community that I deal with, is I would really like stability around the R&D tax concession, and I would like more support there. That's a program that just got going. The world looks to that as being a really, really important reason to come and do business in Australia, and we've still got this thing where it got the legs cut out from underneath it last year. I feel like more could be done on that area. You know, I know it was Malcolm Turnbull, the now departed Prime Minister, that created an innovation agenda. That seems to be sadly discarded, which I think is a terrible thing for the society. And then general business stuff, you know, it was more of the same in my view.
Yeah. I mean, there wasn't a focus on R&D. You're quite right. It was very much pitched as an election budget. One would think very much pitched at voters. Hang around, and if you vote us back in, you might get a bit of a cash payment in 13 weeks' time. Do you think it's actually going to make a difference? Do you think they'll be able to get this budget will actually make a difference to the poll?
Well, I mean, I looked at the election odds, and it got mentioned in the program before. The answer is absolutely nothing has changed there. Really nothing's changed on the foreign exchange markets as well. So it's been greeted by a yawn across the board. And as I say, I just, you know, what is there? 15% chance that the Liberal Party gets re-elected in the election markets at the moment. And I think the chance that the world's going to look like we're talking about at the moment is very, very slim. And I think the question about what type of Australia do we want to leave our kids is left sadly unanswered by this budget.
Yeah. Are you looking then at the Labor alternative? Though, you know, it's higher taxing, higher spending. It's got these changes to negative gearing, these changes to franking credits, and it's got quite an ambitious energy policy now. When it comes to being a responsible economic manager, I mean, how are we going to go in terms of surpluses, and does it matter?
Well, no, I think the tax reform at the top end, I believe that the top end of town doesn't pay their fair share, and I think what Labor's doing, whilst it's going to hit me hard, is actually a good thing to try and repair the damage that we see with an economy getting torn apart between the haves and have-nots. And nobody wants to end up like they are in Britain or across Europe, or even worse in America. And I'm happy to see that there is actually not that much difference except at the edges between the two economic groups. And I think the living wage, that's been part of Australia's social infrastructure for well over 100 years, from the Harvester decision, etc. And I think the fact that we really feel like that's an important core part of our economic infrastructure is worth reminding people of. We don't want to be like the rest of the world.
So what about negative gearing, given this really shaky property market at the moment? As I was mentioning before, the comments in the budget papers that you know, a 10% drop is a 0.5% cut in GDP.
But I think, Tiki, we're financing hundreds of houses a year, and the difference between houses for owner-occupiers and investment, it's a different thing. I really, really wonder with a whole lot of those houses for investment whether anybody's going to end up living them. They seem to be something a bit like all of those eucalyptus schemes, where in fact what you're going to have to do is knock the whole building down and start again, especially the ones that have got the cladding on them, where they have to, you know, they haven't hardly built them now, and they're going to have to rip half of them apart to put new cladding that isn't going to burn down. And it's not a trivial thing. I mean, I'm hearing numbers in the $10 to $30 billion to fix that problem. Where was that in the budget?
Yeah. Hey, you know, you're a very interesting fellow because you're an individual achiever. You believe in hard work and payment for hard work, but equally you've got this very, very strong views about equality. Coming back to how important it is to have a secure budget, a secure economy, are you worried at all by any of these grand plans that Labor has? And just let me bring up one, which is the energy plan and the very ambitious changes that it wants to make to the renewable energy target.
Look, the politics of that just suck for everybody. You know, the fact is that there's this chunk of nut jobs that have a whole lot of marginal seats in rural economies, plus a whole lot of well-funded special interest groups. Unequivocally, I believe all of these sort of single issue interventions are nowhere near as intelligent as just a one-off carbon tax. So from my point of view, all of the interventions are subject to huge amounts of laws of unintended consequence, and this whole obsession at the moment with electric cars and stuff like that, I just wouldn't be for that. But I do believe the world would be a hell of a lot better if we got a $50 or $70 a tonne carbon tax and just got on with it. Do you actually think that we're going to see a surplus in, say, the forward estimates the next 4 years? I honestly don't know. I mean, you think about Australia's 10-year interest rate that far below the US 10-year interest rate. I just don't understand what that means. I just don't understand what is going on at the moment. So what I was trying to say wasn't that I've got some crystal ball and I know better than the government. It's just that you've seen long-term interest rates collapse, and that's got to give you a signal that you shouldn't be too sure about what you're going on. And thinking that you're going to get 3% GDP growth at the same time as you cut immigration, well, you know, I'd love to have, you know, some of what they're smoking where they come up with those numbers.
All right. What about confidence, business confidence and investment confidence in Australia, Mark? What do you think is driving concerns? Is it just that we need to get this budget out the way, we need to get the election out the way? Do you think that'll solve a lot of things, or do you think there are bigger issues?
No, I think, you know, you sometimes see basically from Melbourne Cup Day, Australia goes on holiday, and you certainly from the day they announce the budget, everybody goes on business strike. So the fact that everybody saw this coming, it slowed things up. I think the fact is that it's likely to be a walkover here for the Labor Party, and people are going to have to deal with that. Everybody really has forgotten what it's like to deal with the Labor Party. It'll take them a while to get going, but I see this as being a two-term Labor government, and people are just going to have to suck it up and deal with it. You know, the business community...
Yeah, go on. Going to the stimulus that is in, that both sides seem to agree upon, which is some sort of stimulus on the tax offset sides, income tax, but also for small business in terms of this instant asset write-off and bringing the tax rate down. Do you think that is going to make a big difference to the economy?
I didn't see the details in terms of that versus bracket creep. It feels to me like those are actually pretty good things. You know, the two sides are marching in lockstep, finding some way to tax capital more and incomes less. I think that's a good thing for the society. All this stuff about supporting enterprise, I get that with incomes. I find it harder to understand why necessarily passive income needs to be treated with such concessionary taxation.
Yeah.
One thing I just would like to say, just one thing, I do think what they did on mental health needs a moment to say, actually, that was a courageous thing for a Liberal government to do, and I overwhelmingly support that. You know, that is the great untalked about in Australia's community. And if you think about the fact that other ways that people end up tragically dying young, we do massively underinvest in mental health. So I wholeheartedly support what they did there. Yeah. No, that is a very good call out, and I think more broadly as well, the aged care, the Royal Commission, and the money going to that presumably will also restructure that sector as well, and it'd be very interesting to see whether they go further in terms of youth as well. But can I finally ask you, Mark, about business and a Labor government? In your view, how should big business approach a Labor government? Well, I think the question about big business always has been, and I've been on your show a number of times to debate this, in a choice between 135% more capital gains tax or 135% more income tax, and Australia's its unbelievable ability for corporate boards to buy at the top and sell at the bottom, I think that finding a way to blame the Labor Party for problems of Australian corporates compared to just their woeful ability to actually manage capital and build for the future, I think they really have to look in their own house and not blame the Labor Party. The Labor Party is doing nothing other than addressing what is a global problem here in the world at the moment, which is the returns to capital are unprecedentedly high on a 50-year view, and the returns to anything other than top 1% Labor are on an unprecedentedly low basis, and somebody has to step in and address that. And I think it is about time for a change where you are going to see somebody step in on behalf of Labor. There needs to be some doctrine of countervailing power to what's happening in a network economy where these industries just cascade to monopoly. Look at the Googles, the Facebooks, how much of advertising they're getting. It's just absolutely inexorable how it grows.
Mark Carnegie, it's great to have your straight talking and really refreshing insights. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Tikki.
Well, let's go to the big picture now. And the government's big election campaign centrepiece is this year's budget surplus. It's the first budget surplus since 2007. So how does it rate in terms of economic management? Your Money's chief business reporter, Leo Shanahan, spoke with economist Warren Hogan from the UTS Business School inside the lockup.
Hogan, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, the Australian budget in surplus, at least in 2019-2020, $7.1 billion, but can we believe the assumptions behind it, and what are some of the dangers?
Look, the economic assumptions behind it are pretty optimistic in the sense that if you looked at the full suite of expectations for the economy, the Treasury, the government are right at the top of that. They're one of the more optimistic forecasters, but they look reasonable. They've essentially taken their view that they've had for the last year, reset it after the latest week GDP numbers, which has taken a bit of money away from them now, but then just said we're going to get through this housing bubble, this adjustment in Sydney and Melbourne housing markets, the world economy is going to be okay, and that's going to give us our surplus for the next few years.
Now, you mentioned earlier when we were chatting about household consumption and around that those housing concerns, if there's a small drop-off by their numbers, that's already taken a pretty big hit to the numbers. If that continues, especially assumptions about wages, there's still some dangers there.
Yeah, we've got the detail now of what that move in wage numbers coming down a bit, the consumption numbers coming down a bit. We've essentially just reset the numbers a little bit lower, not much, just because of the last GDP report, and it's taken $15 billion out of the budget over the next 4 years, directly because of wages and employment assumptions, $8 billion. So it's giving us some insight, some scary insight, unfortunately, to what could happen to our federal budget if we experience a domestic recession. And of course, it's not an immaterial thing to be thinking about, because we've got a lot of people out there forecasting quite a soft economy, and we've got financial markets pricing in rate cuts, which is essentially in recognition of the risks that our economy faces. So if we don't get this rosy outcome, if this housing downturn gets worse, our federal budget's going to be in a much worse situation than anything the government's projecting, and could be a lot worse than most people had been thinking before.
Well, obviously there are concerns, and something about these tax cuts or these stimulus to stimulate the economy further with these offsets. They've doubled ostensibly those ones that promised last year, more than matched Labor now. Is that a good way, do you think, to stimulate the economy?
Look, I think it is the right move at this stage. So one of the problems with fiscal policy is that they often move late and it doesn't have an effect when the economy is softening. There's no doubt the economy is softening, people calling for rate cuts. A lot of debate about whether rate cuts will do much. So should we look at fiscal policy? The government has responded here, and they've really tried to front load some of this. So, this upping of the low and middle income tax offset is essentially a retrospective tax cut, and actually it's effectively a handout for a government that's ideologically opposed to handouts. We're going to get a lot of people in Australia getting a bundle of money in about 3 months' time that they didn't think they were going to get before. So that is a fiscal injection. We've got the instant asset write-off being increased and broadened as of today, and so that is going to get businesses spending and putting demand in the economy. So this could be quite an effective short-term fiscal stimulus and may help sort of offset some of these risks that are sitting there around the housing market.
Indeed, business another big winner there. But the government's talking a lot about paying off this net debt, this huge amount in the long term over the next 10 years. Do you believe those assumptions?
Not really, apart from the fact that 10 years is a long time. The budget surpluses are getting pretty large out in the out years. We're talking sort of $30, $40 billion surpluses, and we've just got no history of running these big sort of 1.5 to 2% of GDP surpluses. So there's that piece, and then of course there's an economic story underpinning that says Australia's not only going to have a 30-year economic expansion, we're probably going to have a 40-year one. There's no recessions, there's no adverse economic outcomes in those numbers. So look, the chances of us paying off the debt in the next 10 years are pretty low. It's a nice aspiration, 10-year aspiration, but really it's pretty unlikely.
Well, Warren Hogan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Leo.
After the break, we'll give you some more very interesting budget analysis from inside the lockup. My chat with Your Money's Chief Business Reporter Leo Shanahan, analysis from the Australian's Paul Kelly, who's got some big calls to make, and commentary from political cartoonist Johannes Leek, all coming up in just a moment. Welcome back. Well, let's take you now inside today's budget lockup in Canberra. I was joined earlier by my colleague, Your Money Chief Business Reporter Leo Shanahan. Here's what he had to say about the budget.
Well, Leo, talking to the people in the room here, you'd have to say it's not a very exciting budget, but it's pretty carefully pitched, you'd think.
Look, I'd almost phrase it as a re-release of last year's. It's like a director's cut, like a redux, except, of course, those income tax offsets, which come in so much earlier. They now have not only matched, but they beat basically the ALP in that pledge.
But it's not going to be ran through tomorrow. It's actually going to have to wait until...
Yeah.
Supposedly they get back into government.
And that's the politics of it. And ultimately, look, there will be some measures put through before the election, but the gamble will be for the coalition re-elect us in that unlikely scenario, yes, and we'll put through these tax offsets, bigger tax cuts longer term. It's a pretty big gamble, and it's also one that goes at the expense of actually having a surplus this year.
And also, I think people are quite nervous about the slowing growth and the housing market, this sort of thing, and the idea of the economic management responsibility there. I can't remember how many times Josh Frydenberg today has said we've done it all without raising taxes. That's very much pushed home and very much alluding to Labor's negative gearing changes, I think.
Yeah, and essential to his speech as well is that it's consistent in that, you know, we'll cut taxes, we'll give a leg up. It's about boosting business, small business being a big winner out of this. Again, extending that offset for small business. But it's continuing reiteration of Labor will tax, and that goes to negative gearing and the shared buybacks, of course,
and a stimulus through these tax cuts, of course, of some sort, but no surplus this year.
No, and look, it's arguably a bit of a gamble. Although, you know, some would say, look, he's not going to get re-elected, so why not just go out and say, look, I had one surplus in this period. But look, they're hoping that this will get them over the line. I doubt it's going to be enough in that context. But
indeed, Leo.
Moving to politics now, and is today's budget going to save the federal government from losing the election in May? Well, I spoke with the Australian's editor-at-large, Paul Kelly, from Inside the Lockup. Well, I'm joined now in the lockup by the editor-at-large at the Australian, Paul Kelly. Paul, Josh Frydenberg's first budget, how has he pitched it?
He's very pumped up, he's very happy. Yeah. There are two great themes to this budget, Ticky. It's an election budget that enshrines very ambitious tax cuts. And secondly, on the economic front, this is a return to surplus budget after the budget's been in deficit.
He could have had a surplus this year. Why did he choose not to, do you think?
He did the wrong thing. He should have had a surplus this year. We've got a narrow, wafer-thin deficit for this year, the year 2018-19, the year that's just finishing, and the surplus, of course, is in the coming year, 1920. I believe very much that for political reasons, he should have had the surplus this year, so he could then say, we're not just budgeting for a surplus, we are in surplus. He didn't do it. I think he should have.
Why do you think he didn't?
Because the focus is very, very much on the next 13, 14 weeks. You see, stage one of the tax cut is a return to people of $2,000 after they get back their income tax return. That's going to be in about 13 or 14 weeks. So there's this tremendous incentive for people. $2,000, this is really across the income range from about $45,000 a year to $90,000 a year, give or take a few thousand. So it's that low to middle income range, and there is a very, very significant tax refund for these people coming at the end of the financial year. That's the focus, and of course that's going to be the government's focus for the election.
What will Labor's response be, and is this enough, do you think, to give the government a chance of staying in power?
First of all, let's look at the government strategy. There are three stages to the tax package, and the tax package will be presented as one whole package. It won't be broken up. But critically, it won't be legislated before the election. The government will aim to legislate the package after the election, that is, after it wins. So its pitch to the Australian people will be, here's this package, $158 billion worth of income tax cuts. This is what we're campaigning on. If the Morrison government is re-elected, if Josh Frydenberg is re-elected as Treasurer, then the package will be legislated. What will Labor do? Well, I think Labor will sign off on the first part of the package, which is the immediate $2,000 for low and middle income earners. But I think when it comes to the more ambitious structural changes in the tax system further on down the track, I think Labor will put forward its own package, but it won't agree with those aspects of the government's package. But of course, we'll have to wait and see.
And will this be enough to keep the government in power?
Well, that's going to be a very, very difficult ask. I think that there's no doubt that Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg have said, we're not going to die wondering. So they've really gone out and they've put a lot of money on the line here for the Australian middle class. But the difficulty, of course, is that they've got to repair the damage done over a number of years in terms of disunity in the government, change of Prime Minister, and the fact that there's a cynical electorate which all the polls have indicated are prepared to change the government. So it's going to be a very, very tall order for them. They're trying hard.
Paul Kelly, brilliant to get you. Thank you.
Thanks, Tikki.
Well, before we wrap up tonight, we thought we'd give you a little visual take of today's federal budget. Leo Shanahan sat down with political cartoonist and the increasingly great Johannes Leek a little earlier.
How'd you feel when you got the call up to do your first budget cartoon?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was kind of in the dark about the entire sort of process, but I knew my dad had done it a few times, and yeah, I kind of had a bit of, well, a fair idea of what to expect, but working in this kind of room, you know, I tend to work out of the back of a granny flat at my place, no distractions, and in my own time in a way, but yeah, the pressure's on here, I can feel it.
All right, so how does it work practically speaking? Because I think people will be quite interested. You know, you go to a news conference, a couple of ideas around direction of the picture, obviously dependent upon what the budget says, and what happens?
Yeah, well, I did try and come in armed with a couple of scenarios, possible ways for it to go depending on the way the budget went. In the end, it was more like it just kind of came together over conversation with the editors, to be honest. This time, the ideas that I brought in with me weren't worth much in this case, so we ended up going in a completely different direction, but worked it out fairly quickly, and I'm sort of happy with that.
You know, Freidenberg's got a very cherub-like face, so it works quite well.
Yeah, look, that's precisely right, and we felt that there was
too flattering to Josh.
there was a sense of spreading the love around with this budget. At least that's the intention. So we've got him looking quite kind of cheesy there on his cloud, like the little cherub, and he's shooting little arrows off, heart-shaped arrows to a fairly grateful-looking public. So that's how that all came together.
So this gets sent out at what, 7 o'clock, and then by 9 o'clock or so on the Australian's front page website, and then the front page of the paper tomorrow.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, it's first for me, but very exciting, and I'll be chuffed to see it on the paper.
Yeah, Hannes, thanks so much for joining us, mate.
Thank you, mate. Cheers, Leo.
Yeah, honestly, yeah, that's all for tonight's Tikki Budget Special. To rewatch this episode and for more of today's federal budget analysis, head to yourmoney.com.au/budget 2019. Tomorrow night on Tikki, our federal budget coverage continues, of course, with special post-budget analysis show. You can catch that tomorrow night at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Thanks for your company.